OCO, hello everyone. Welcome to Speaking Our Truth, podcast for change by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I am your host, Leanne Pippin, and I'm a member of Cherokee Nation. Before we get started, let's hear a quick word from NIWRC.
The NIWRC provides culturally grounded webinars to lift up the collective voices of grassroots advocates working to end violence against Native women. Sign up for upcoming webinars at niwrc.org/events.
I want to introduce our guest host for this mini-series, Heather Bruegel.
Heather is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin
and first-line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. She is a policy specialist here at NIWRC. Heather is a historian and frequent lecturer whose research includes topics such as American history, colonization, indigeneity, the history of American boarding schools, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. She is currently a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and the First Nations Education ED doctoral program.
Hi, my name is Heather Bruegel, and I'm the policy specialist with NIWRC. Welcome to Families Taking Action in the Face of MMIW, Episode 5. This series sheds light on the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We are releasing an episode each day as part of the National Week of Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. The brave families in this podcast will share their stories and experiences with their loved ones who have gone missing or murdered. Please listen with care, knowing that the subject matter can be triggering and take space when you need. Throughout this series, we have heard from families who have experienced the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We have also heard about many barriers and challenges that these families face trying to get justice for their loved ones. We wanted to take this episode and dive into more education that can help families gain justice. We are joined again today by Patsy Whitefoot. Patsy is a citizen of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. She's an educator, an activist, and continuously lends her voice to the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis in Washington state and nationally. Patsy has served in education and has also served on the Yakama Tribal Council. She is retired and continues to work and live in White Swan, where strong tribal roots have survived. Patsy is also the co-host for War Cry Podcast, a podcast that discusses issues and historical connections about missing and murdered Indigenous women, men, and LGBTQ2S community members. For 30 years, Patsy has served as the education chair for the affiliated tribes of the Northwest Indians, and her vision for health of her people is steeped in her ancestral knowledge formed by Indigenous language, cultures, histories, and tied to the rich landscapes. Thank you again for joining us today, Patsy. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge. We heard many stories this week regarding barriers that families can face, from jurisdictional challenges to issues with law enforcement. We heard many times that when going to report your loved one missing, things can move rather slowly. So, Patsy, I'm wondering, what actions can you give our audience who may be facing these same challenges?
So when a loved one goes missing, it's important to take inventory of that possibility. So when this occurred with my family, my sisters began talking to one another and realized that she hadn't been home for several days. And my sister lived with me. Her name was Daisy Mayhew, and we lived in White Swan. But for me, it wasn't unusual for her to visit family members or friends. And so when she began missing, I didn't think anything of it because I knew she would call me or let me know where she was. And so because we're a very diverse, remote reservation, she could be just almost anywhere visiting with family, as I said, either here on the reservation or other places, or she could have been playing ball. She was a very avid ball player as well, so that's something she could have been doing. And she was an adult. You thought she would be home any day. However, when she didn't show, one of my other sisters said that we really need to see if we can find her. And that was important for my sister to be able to share that. It's, we need to take inventory of where she could possibly be. And so that's what we did. We called to these different places to family and her friends as well. And we came to the realization after, a few days that she may be missing. There were other women in our community who were missing and murdered, but I think you never think about it being a part of your own family. There's more to just making a report. And it's also important to make certain that you have, either close friends or loved ones that are going to be a part of this work that needs to go on for the long haul. After having been together with other families who experienced similar situation with missing or murdered loved ones, we came to understand that it's important to also have someone that you can talk with. Like in my case, I was stunned by it, trying to accept that she was missing. Perhaps someone abducted her, kidnapped her, because here in our community as well, it isn't unusual for some of our family members to go missing and or be abducted as well. So having to grapple with that was a real challenge for me personally. So I would urge family members to have someone with them that can talk them through this whole process. And sometimes that may not be family. It might be someone that you've confided with in the past, or it could be a cultural specialist that's been a part of your tribe, or whoever it may be, which is important. It's good to also document information that you have or that you may know about your sister. That's something that we did not do during that time. This was like 30 years ago, and people just weren't talking to one another about, our women being missing or murdered. Also contain all of her personal items. Over a period of time, I began to put her personal items aside. And then after a few years, just began to remove things from my house. So it takes time because, again, like we had no idea where she was and what had happened to her. And it wasn't until several years later that there were personal items of hers found in the mountainous area, which is the closed area of our reservation. And it was at that point that you had concrete information that something happened to your sister. And so through this process, as much as you can, it's important to document. And if you're talking with someone, to document who that individual is and what they represent, because over time, like I said, your mind gets a little blurry during that time, and you need to know what kind of official capacity you're being communicated with by particularly law enforcement. For us, in our case, the FBI could have been in Yakima, or it could have been Seattle, which is an urban community, or the Spokane area. When I talked with any one of these individuals, I just lost track of who I was talking to, and I don't recall any of the names of the individuals I talked with. More recently, after about 33 years, we did finally receive part of my sister's remains, and it took time to determine whether that was her. And so the individual that I've been working with has been our county coroner and someone that I came to know over time and was able to communicate with him. You begin to learn more about people when people take time to talk with you, to go through some of the processes. And that's what happened with the individual that I've been communicating with. It also takes, individuals who you're going to trust as well. Trust is a big thing, because when you have different law enforcement officials coming in and out of your life, you don't know who they are, and they don't always return calls, don't call you back. And so it's important to document all of that information. because after 7 years in our case, our family declared our sister deceased, and we conducted our own traditional ceremonies for her to be declared deceased. And even though a family member may do that to us, of course, she wasn't deceased. We still didn't know, but after 7 years, some of the elders thought we should do that. So of course, at that time, that's what we did. And so I just want to urge family members to make certain that either your family or a combination of your family and a close relative or trusted friend that you might have to help be there for you and help walk through this process. And basically, it was my sisters and I that just walked through this process pretty much on our own. If I had known what I know today, I probably would have done things a lot different. So I just want it to be encouraging, particularly of our family members who experience this. I went through a process of even having my grandchildren document who they were. I began teaching them their names, to be able to articulate their name, their parents' names, and the community where they lived, and what tribe that they were, just so that they could learn to identify themselves. And it's unfortunate that I had to do that, but I had this really strong urge that we needed to do that because of what was happening in our community. We're talking mainly about missing women and girls. However, I also think it's important, that we also address the needs of our young children, 2 and 3 years old, and train them to be able to, be aware of their surroundings and their environment. And because the community where I come from is also very high poverty. And when you have poverty, then you also have, the drugs in our case that are part of our community. So I urge you to just be mindful of all those kinds of circumstances in your community.
Yeah, thank you for that, Patsy. It sounds like there's a lot of things that families can do. And it sounds, from the onset, to have somebody there with you who can listen, who can maybe help ask questions, who can keep score of really what's going on. And that sounds like the main message that you're really trying to get across right there. Jurisdictional challenges often play a role in trying to investigate and find missing loved ones. When it comes to Indian country, jurisdiction can be divided into tribal, county, state if you're a public law 280 state, and then federal, and that includes the Federal Bureau of Investigation, known as the FBI, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, known as the BIA. Oftentimes, families and other law enforcement agencies aren't sure who to call in or who to report their loved one missing to. There can be questions about where the person lived as opposed to where they actually went missing or where a crime took place. This can lead to precious time being wasted when trying to find a loved one. Families often don't know how to work through this system. Patsy, in addition to the work that you do on the ground, you're also a co-host for the War Cry podcast, which is a podcast that discusses the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, men, LGBTQ2S community members. How did War Cry come to be?
Well, in our community, there were young women that were, talking amongst each other about the need to build awareness and increase the education of this issue. And so with the young women who were more skilled and experienced at technology, they began to talk about this need and decided that we were going to do the War Cry podcast. I was asked to come in as an elder. I had worked with these individuals previously in my role as an education manager, and we had also worked with the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington. So we were involved in, research work in our community and providing support for prevention initiatives, we came together and began meeting and discussing what we were going to share and address. Our host had a story that she wanted to focus on, and so that's how we began our podcast. It occurred during our treaty time. The treaties that we have as Indian people, we know and we recognize the fact that, our tribal ancestors, were very diligent in addressing what the needs were at that time, over 150 years ago. And then we also knew that there were issues with colonization. And so we took that all into account when we began focusing on this issue. And of course, jurisdiction was one of those major issues. It wasn't just jurisdiction. There's a whole host of issues that the family members encounter. Our podcast focuses not only on the professionals that work with this issue, but also the families. It's an education for all of us to continue having this type of dialogue, like around jurisdiction issues. And so I'm just thinking back to some of the podcasts we did hold. We did have one regarding the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the role of realty. But then on the other hand, we worked with the county coroner. He works not only at the county level, but he also has partners that he works with, on a statewide and national basis as well. And so just by working with him as an example, he was able to, speak to the forensic analysis at the state level, but also continue to do the anthropological work that needed to be done. So sometimes you need to work with various professions as well. And then he was able to work with the DNA laboratory. There's all of these jurisdictions that you become aware of as we continue to work at the state level or, in the community or at the federal level. It's a whole educational process because I'm not an individual with a background in law enforcement. So you really have to pay attention to what goes on at all levels of government. Parents or family members are the ones that are the advocates. They're the ones that have the voice, and they're the ones that want to make certain that there's transparency and accountability and justice for our families.
Yeah, Patsy, that kind of, what resources can you or the War Cry podcast offer to families?
So on the War Cry podcast, we do have a listing of some of the resources that are available, but at different sectors of government. Some common ones are the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I began to learn about all the resources that the center has. So that's the national organization there to support families around not only this issue, but around domestic violence and well-being of family members. It's well equipped to support and help families, including the role of family advisory that they have in place. Others are your state agencies, your tribal agencies, and federal agencies as well. I would urge families to look for, that kind of support. In my case, more recently, I had a close cousin that was found deceased in front of a hotel in Wenatchee, Washington. My sister called me and let me know what had happened. And unfortunately, this happened during Christmas, and it was a real challenge to try to get a hold of people, law enforcement or the FBI. What I ended up doing was calling our Washington state tribal liaisons that we have for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And they were the only ones that returned the calls during that time. So we have a tribal liaison in Eastern Washington and a tribal liaison in Western Washington. And so by having these two women there, knowing that we had their phone numbers, we were able to communicate with them about, a cousin who had been deceased or found deceased in front of a hotel. And so I was able to share that information with my sister and let her know. And she was able to begin communicating and talking more regularly with the FBI as well, or the detective that was working on this case. And it's still being looked at today. This is about 3 months later now, but she's still following up with them. I would also reach out to the various Native women's coalitions as well that exist. I wasn't aware of these coalitions and what they were about. It wasn't until I went to the Women Are Sacred conference before the pandemic that I began to hear discussions about coalitions that exist regionally. Of course, I shared at your tribal or local level. In our case, where I'm located, we have a YWCA for focusing on domestic violence as well. I think that's a wonderful resource to have too, because they're also addressing the diverse needs of women, not just Native women, but women in general from all backgrounds, socioeconomic conditions. And then in addition, of course, then the tribal resources that exist, some with the behavioral health programs and perhaps the Bureau of Indian Affairs social work programs as well. So more and more there's increase and awareness of this issue. And I realize also that family members may not want to go speak to some of these resources. However, if not, I would urge you to talk to a family member to find out what kind of support you can get, or friends in your circle to help provide support to you as well. Because that's happened with some of the families that I get to talk to and that I've known over many, many years, and just helping them to navigate all of these issues, plus the jurisdictions as well that are involved, because it's not just tribal jurisdiction, it's state jurisdiction, it could be county jurisdiction, it could be the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it could be the Department of Justice, it could be the FBI. There are so many sectors that one has to communicate with, and there are people there to help support you.
Yes, thank you for that, Patsy, and thank you for the mentioning of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center as a resource that people can use. And finally, what I want to ask you is, we've heard a lot this week from families who have lost loved ones, yourself included, and the struggles that they've had to go through. So my last question for you is, what can families do to make sure that they feel that they're being heard?
As I shared earlier, it's important to just communicate with one another, even if that's in your own family as a starting point, or have a close friend, someone that's close to you, or there may be an elder or spiritual leader that's a part of your life. In my case, it was my children. They just said that I need to become active because I became kind of depressed. My son said, you need to get moving, and you got to be our mom. You're our mom. You need to take care of us. And so just simple things like that is being open to it. And that's what my children did for me. When we talk about, the fact that life is sacred, it reminds me of our teachings that the lives of our children are sacred as well. You never know what you will learn from them. Listen to the voices of our children, because our children are intelligent. They know what life is about, and they're learning as well. So be open to your children. It's also that, and then there are certain, say, tribal protocols you must follow with the death of a loved one or someone who's missing. And so that's what we did. We followed those protocols of, taking our time to wait. In some cases, it could be a year before you do anything, or you might have a memorial. In our case, we waited for 7 years. However, our life continued to go on, and then taking the risks of even communicating with law enforcement as well, because it is a huge step to be able to do for some families, because the negative connotations of law enforcement in families, and it still exists today. and then urging families to call different levels of government to at least begin getting answers. In the case that occurred about 3 months ago, just by calling our Washington state tribal liaisons, that was a huge step for family members to recognize, when you're in the moment of these kinds of situations, you really are at a loss. And so sometimes you're going to hold the hand of family members and make those initial calls and provide that communication until a family member can be able to get on their own feet, because it takes time. And so it's, again, just knowing those resources that are out there. More recently in our state, it was through the family members that we've been advocating for legislation to help meet the needs of our tribal communities. And so in the Washington state legislature, we helped to create the tribal liaison positions. As I shared earlier, there's one in Eastern Washington, another in Western Washington. And so those to me are like our anchors. If we have questions, we can call them. And so just that alone is very significant by having women in those kinds of roles. The support or the testimony that I gave for this legislation, I strongly urge and advocated for Native women to be involved in law enforcement. I'm beginning to see some changes. I'm able to see more women that are coming on, as tribal police or their detectives, and they're in various sectors of government as well, whether that be the BIA, FBI, or state level as well. We can now say we have 2 women who are at the state level as law enforcement officers and are providing that kind of support that we need. So it takes that kind of advocacy at the state level and getting to know who the people are. And the same thing can occur at the federal level as well, with the various laws that are put into place. It's a huge undertaking, but if that's something that someone wants to do, there are individuals who are around your community who's able to support you. And, the Women's Resource Center, there's a family advisory committee there working with them. Throughout the United States, these women come together and they are also a resource. It includes representation also from Alaska Natives, as well as representation from Native Hawaiians. And so I think that the family members are a huge asset to the organization. And I would urge, family members to become engaged when you think you're ready. And if it's not something you want to do, but you want to be able to speak to someone, please feel free to follow up with Saul.
Thank you so much, Patsy. It's a lot of great information, and I'm sure the families and those listening to this podcast will definitely appreciate that. I want to thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your story. We appreciate your time and energy. And also, I wanted to thank you for sharing the story of your sister, Daisy Mae Heath. If anyone listening has information regarding the case of Daisy Mae, please contact the FBI at 509-747-5195 or the Yakima Nation Police Department at 509-865-2933. We also want to share the Strong Hearts Native Helpline should you need culturally appropriate advocacy. And that number is 844-762-8483. Or you can contact them online by visiting strongheartshelpline.org. This podcast was made possible with funding from the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. Thank you for listening.
Wadeau, thank you so much for listening. We hope you have time to process what you've learned and share this podcast with others. For everyone listening, please make sure to visit niwrc.org/podcast to view the show notes and links related to the episodes. You can also find the special MMIW edition of Restoration Magazine at niwrc.org/restoration-magazine. I am your host, Leanne Pippin. To everyone out there, thank you so much for listening. Take care.